Manthan Samvaad deserves our immense gratitude because they have organized a series of intellectual events, and this is of utmost necessity today when we see that an anti-intellectual character, an anti-intellectual national character is being built with great aggression. And we are very honored to be here, and we would like to thank Ajay Gandhi and M.R. Vikram for inviting us. We are philosophers. That means two things, at least, to be mentioned today. The first is that we do not have at our disposal the nuances which historians indulge in. Philosophy is a discipline which is concerned with the future. And that means that philosophy must be concerned with the freedom in the present, which allows us to create new and interesting futures. So when we speak of Gandhi today, it might cause some discomfort because our title is Gandhi's Truth. And this title speaks in two directions. One is the truth according to M.K. Gandhi, but the other is the truth or the meaning of the system of M.K. Gandhi's thought. And he was a very systematic thinker, not just a politician, not just somebody who changed from time to time. And on this occasion, we will bring together these two directions. There is a discussion, of course, then that we would have to have about the relationship between Gandhi's system and the present political crisis in our country. But we'll keep that for another occasion. Let me mention the second thing that perhaps defines philosophers. It's that we like to take time. We like to talk, taking a lot of time, and an hour is something like the right amount of time to begin with. But you too take a lot of time, otherwise you wouldn't be here today. To me, this feels like, this whole morning and afternoon feels like a festive occasion in a university where you have back-to-back classes or an academic conference. But then, don't worry that I'm going to waste precious time by meandering, because to keep time also means to stick to an allotted time, not cut into some other activity or another person. And we don't want to cut into the time of Sagarika Ghosh and Vivek Kaul, and also not tea time. So there is this expression, don't take too much time. But there is another expression related to time, which is of the spirit of our times, zeitgeist. We usually use the phrase for it, an epochal conception of time. For instance, a way of expressing zeitgeist would be, what is it like to be in the time of the artist Banksy or the artist Theo Jansen, the times of populism, the times of modern technology. And here, to explain one of these examples, modern technology, or rather digital technology, it means that we understand ourselves and each other. We understand our world. We understand our actions, the way we live in the home and the workplace through modern technology. It is something that conditions, limits, and mediates our existence. In the same way, if we could think of the question today, are we still in the times of M.K. Gandhi? One way or the other, the answer is yes, we are in the times of M.K. Gandhi. We heard of it this morning. But then we ought to ask another question. Must we remain in the times of M.K. Gandhi? Shaj will take up this question later, but to begin with, let me focus on being in the times of M.K. Gandhi. Now, this phrase appears to hide the essence of Gandhi from us. Many of us implicitly understand what is the essence of Gandhi, and we often struggle with it as well. Often we tactically evade the essence of Gandhi. But if one were to enumerate it quickly, all the ideas available to us, we would say that Gandhi stands for secularism, he stands for transparency in public life, for being a good person, although this is a very complicated thing, what it means to be a good person. Also to stand for teaching children to report the truth, to stand for a simple and minimal living. Now, with or without the help of Gandhi, many of these moral principles that I listed are necessary for all societies. So, for instance, secularism is necessary. Then some of the principles I listed are desirable for society, such as to expect children or to teach children to tell the truth. But then there are some other principles that I listed which are undesirable. For instance, to have absolute transparency in public life. What would happen to the protection of whistleblowers if we were committed to absolute transparency in public life? Now, of all these terms that I listed, truth is the most important one for Gandhi, and we could say that it is the leading concept of Gandhi. But truth meant different things in Gandhi. I'm not saying that there was no consistency, but let me quote him here. Truth is the sovereign principle, which includes numerous other principles. This truth is not only truthfulness in word, but truthfulness in thought also, and not only the relative truth of our conception, but the absolute truth, the eternal principle that is God. So, what we have here is a sovereign principle of truth, which is absolute truth. Then there are the minor principles, such as truth-telling, transparency, regularity, and so on. So we can see that truth is a very complicated thing for Gandhi, and for that reason, we may have often felt, and we do find, that Gandhi was equivocating when he was speaking of truth. It may not always be clear which conception of truth he was invoking in a particular statement of his. So we will come to this sovereign principle, absolute truth, very soon. But let me go through first the minor and the familiar truths. And of these, truth-telling is the easiest to understand. So to begin with, telling the truth means to report your own convictions. So for example, assume that you looked out of your window at the sky at night and you saw a UFO. Now, you're quite convinced that it was a UFO, although you think it's a very improbable thing, the whole idea of a UFO. So if you were to report it to your friends, you know that they would find it laughable and they wouldn't believe you. And nevertheless, you decide to go and tell the truth, because you act out of your conviction here. So in this case of truth-telling, truth is opposed to lying, and truth, of course, is opposed to fiction. And then there is a second kind of truth, which is just empirical truth. So supposing I say that the sky is green today. It sounds a bit absurd, but then assume that when I say it, I'm a member of a community which uses the word green for the color gray. And then suddenly this statement makes sense. It's not a trouble. Or assume that I have a house cat which I have named God, and I keep from time to time saying, oh, God has come. So this, of course, would not be a lie because of the convention I'm using, but a religious neighbor of mine might certainly feel very convinced at the regular comings and goings of God in an atheist household. So there is this problem with the ambiguities of language. Language affords multiple senses, and you can't determine one at a given time. But these ambiguities are also the resources of poetry, and they are also the resources of joke. So to say, chup hoke baith jao gaay ke saath bhains, oh, I forgot what it was, bhains mat karo. So what is exactly being said with the word bhains? And Gandhi did often refer to these difficulties he had with the ambiguities of language. He said that often his difficulties with truth-telling were because language was ambiguous, and especially to tell the absolute truth. So in this case, we would oppose truth and falsity, and of course, there is something called deliberate falsity. So for instance, and I think this was also discussed in the morning, if we hear something like, India has never been greater in the eyes of the world than today, or if we were to hear that India is the most powerful economy of the world today, could be deliberate falsities. Then there is the third conception, which is truth in the sense of being consistent in one's conduct. But this idea of truth as consistency has something deeper within it, which is consistency of the system of thought. So there are these two consistencies which Gandhi found extremely important. You should practice what you preach, so consistency between practicing and preaching, but also that what you preach, the system of principles from out of which you preach actions, that system should not have contradictions. So for instance, if one were to withdraw into a monk's quarter, then the consistency of your conduct would be a pretty easy thing. You would just do the same thing and stick to it. But Gandhi wanted to derive his actions from a system of thought which was itself consistent, and this is where the complexity and the utmost difficulty of Gandhi's concept of truth concerns us. So here the sense of truth is opposed to contradiction. Contradiction means, so contra means against, and deco means I speak. So contradiction is someone speaking against himself, and therefore if you want to attain the consistency of actions, Gandhi would offer the technique of taking a vow. And so a vow would be when you make a promise to yourself to either do something or to not do something, and then you would strive not to contradict your vow. But there is yet another truth, which is extremely important for Gandhi, and initially we do have a familiarity with it. It is when Gandhi spoke the sentence, "God is truth." But you will remember that soon after, he rejected it and reversed the statement in order to say, "Truth is God." And this is not a simple or casual reversal. It is very meaningful. So when he says, "Truth is God," what does he mean? Is it that truth-telling in all instances is an appearance of God? All mathematical theorems, the most consistent of things made by man, are mathematical theorems divine? Now, we know that even Gandhi would not believe such a thing. But rather, the case here is truth in the sense that, does the world have a meaning? Does it have a purpose? Does it have a coherence, the whole world? Truth names the principle according to which the world and each and everything in it is ordered in one order. And Gandhi did believe that there was such a truth. So for this reason, he believed that natural calamities which affected millions of people were not meaningless. They came to happen in a world which was perfectly ordered, and indeed, they were punishments that God visited upon men when they crossed the limits that God had set for them. If this were the case, then we could understand, of course, that Gandhi is very akin to a classical theologian, these kinds of preoccupations. But Gandhi was not even satisfied to say that truth is God, this perfect order. So there is a third moment in Gandhi's thinking of absolute truth. And let me quote him here. "I am thinking here of that truth which transcends even God. A truth which is greater than God, a God which is something less than truth, such that God must obey this truth." This is a very novel idea that Gandhi created. Again, let me quote him. "God is the very image of the vow. God would cease to be God if he swerved from his own laws even by a hair's breadth. The sun is a great keeper of observances, and hence the possibility of measuring time and publishing almanacs." So Gandhi was explaining the world through this order where God takes a vow of truth. This vow allows the maker to maintain the world in consistency, and therefore the meaning of the whole world is in truth. This adherence, or we could say the satyagraha done by God, ensures that the world is orderly, and so according to Gandhi, this order is visible in physical laws as well as moral laws, and he found that both were systematized by scientists like Newton and Darwin. So we must remember that Gandhi was a modern man who was sufficiently familiar with the works of these scientists, with the science of his times. He wrote about it frequently, but this was the concern under which he understood them. So something interesting is happening in theology with Gandhi. God is no longer someone with absolute freedom. He cannot perform miracles. He is merely the best of all satyagrahis. Now, as we know very well, Gandhi's politics was always guided by religion. Of course, it was not this or that religion, but rather it was this kind of unusual theological system which he had conceived. And he said that politics without religion was evil. Then this peculiar and innovative theology has serious implications for politics, and Gandhi's global political vision was not comfortable with his own time. Rather, it was a time that he was still looking forward to, in which this theological vision could bring an order to the world, or could express the order of the world. Is it possible that today we are entering an epoch, a Gandhian epoch of world politics, but we have not fully grasped the implications of this theological conception under which the world politics could be underway?
Good afternoon. Okay. It's not over. I think I'm just going to continue from where Divya finished. It is clear that Gandhi was not trying to build a nation where everyone tells the truth. That would, of course, make things like surveillance unnecessary, but it would also make conflicts permanent. Instead, Gandhi wanted to create a whole world according to the truth of his system. This truth, as Divya mentioned earlier, is the sovereign principle or truth that is higher than God. There is a certain implication of truth which is common to all senses of the word truth. It is that truth implies regularity. A mathematical system, a physical theory of nature, a well-written computer program, they all have this property that they exhibit regularity when they unfold or when they are explored by someone. For example, on Earth, given the parameters, things will always fall down, water will always flow, and so on. Mechanical devices exhibit the same regularity. For instance, a clockwork. Gandhi was very fond of mechanical devices, like Descartes and Newton before him. The ideal society for Gandhi would be like a mechanical system. It should repeat itself without any variation. If the wristwatch that he used were to display variations, then we would say that the wristwatch has an error. For this reason, Gandhi also said that Western civilization, which was exhibiting perpetual variations, was an error on earth. The same rule applies to societies which begin to transform themselves. They are a people in error. Ideal societies can be recognized if they ever come to exist. Imagine that a visitor, say an anthropologist, today who records the activities of an ideal society for a year, observes what they do from season to season, and he were to return to the place where he came from, and then after 1,000 years, another descendant of this anthropologist, maybe another anthropologist, would return to the same ideal village, and then he would also observe the functioning of this society. And if it is indeed an ideal society, when this new anthropologist were to compare the ceremonies and functions of this ideal society, he would find that they are exactly the same even after 1,000 years. If God took the vow of truth, and if his fidelity to the truth is manifest in the world in the form of physical laws, how should then man conduct himself? This is not a silly question, but something quite difficult and profound. In fact, it is what we call an existential question too, if you remove God. With these questions, Gandhi was in the neighborhood of metaphysics, although Gandhi was not a practicing metaphysician. But Gandhi was not the first person to ask these types of questions. Theologians often seek to build a world according to a divine plan, such as Saint Augustine or Saint Thomas. But as we have been seeing, Gandhi's theology is radically new. In most forms of traditional theology, both God and men have freedoms. God can make miracles and man can sin. So miracles, particularly in Catholic religion, is God who created the world and then perfected the laws according to which the world would function, would violate these very laws. So God's intervention in the world in the form of the violations of the very laws of his creation would be called miracle. And in the case of sins, of course, man creates moral laws according to often the wish of God, and then man violates these rules because man has the freedom. And this, again, is human freedom. There are several stories of violation of natural laws. The sea parts, men return from the dead, mountains are moved, nations disappear, and so on. Of course, Gandhi's God does not perform miracles, as that would be the violation of the principles of satyagraha. God is the most perfect satyagrahi. Gandhi often called God the maker, and that was a more consistent term for him. And his maker made man in his own image. Here, by image, it means that just like God, who is a perfect vow taker, the one with absolute fidelity to truth, man also ought to be someone who has absolute fidelity to truth. Then, man ought to be higher than all the nature that man finds around him. So, Gandhi would expect of man a kind of conduct which is at least as regular and at least as truthful as nature. I quote Gandhi, "I grant that we are higher than the sun. How much more necessary for us to be at least as true and faithful as the sun, if not truer and more faithful." This gives us a sense of Gandhi's political vision already. Gandhi believed that the faculty of reason allowed mankind to understand that man is closer to God than any other thing in the world. That is, man ought to desire to be like God. Gandhi said, man is not at peace with himself till he has become like unto God. Now, this is also interesting. On the one hand, man was made in the image of the Maker, but at the same time, man is not yet the Maker. So, the hidden desire in all human beings is to be like the Maker. Of course, like unto God is not the same thing as our everyday expression, he is playing God. We say this about dictators and technocrats particularly when they do irrational things. Gandhi's maker is something which these men would never want to be. Now, what he meant by the expression to become like unto God was the ability to adhere to truth, or to be a satyagrahi like truth. Divya had mentioned earlier that on another occasion we should look at the importance of Gandhi's contributions to what we call the independence movement and to the role he played in constructing the ethos of our republic. But there is something which should be evident from this far. Though through his conviction that politics must not be conducted independent of religion, which would be evil for him, Gandhi set the conditions at the very origin of politics in the subcontinent for everything which confounds us today. But if we cannot institute another origin today, then nothing can change. I'm being a little evasive and evocative here at this moment because of the occasion. Now, Gandhi's political project was meant to overwhelm the world. He was not merely an internationalist. He was one of the first thinkers to imagine the conditions and the criteria for a global politics. Because Gandhi was not concerned with just the well-being of a particular people, such as Indians or Gujaratis or Bengalis. Instead, he wanted to create a world in which all men were satyagrahis. We know that for Gandhi, non-violence was the same thing as adherence to truth, or the adherence to the sovereign principle of truth. That is, the higher truth according to which God functions and which is made manifest on earth. And if we were to create a world where every man, every human being is a perfect satyagrahi like God, then a God-like kingdom on earth would manifest for Gandhi. Gandhi often said that truth and nonviolence were the two sides of the same coin. They were both means and ends of one another. Gandhi would also talk about the love of truth. It's an expression which is very similar to the Greek expression philosophia, which is a particular kind of exclusionary love of wisdom. After all, being a lover of truth is the same thing as being a satyagrahi. But what was love for M.K. Gandhi? His notion of love reveals much more about his global project. Let me quote him at length here. The law of love is nothing but a law of truth. Without truth, there is no love. Without truth, it may be affection, as for one's country, to the injury of others, or infatuation, as of a young man for a girl, or love may be unreasoning and blind, as of ignorant parents for their children. Love transcends all animality and it is never partial. Satyagraha has therefore been discussed as a coin on whose face you read love and on the reverse you read truth. It is a coin current everywhere and has indefinable value. This text from Gandhi sounds quite mystifying, but unlike mysticism, which is a discourse of authority without content, Gandhi is being very precise here. First of all, this dispels the notion that sentiments such as nationalism and love of one's own country first were of any interest to him. Further, it is not even love in the sense of the expression loved ones, by which we usually mean our partiality to some people in showing our concerns to them. Instead, Gandhi wanted to create a world where all men were able to practice what he called this very difficult notion, impartial love. Of course, one can interpret this impartial love in the terms of Christian love, which is caritas. And caritas originally meant dearness, which means in the sense of very expensive. And this is a feature of most expressions of love in most languages, that when you express that you love somebody more than something else, then you say that that person is extremely expensive. For example, the French expression chérie and the English expression dear, and I think in Malayalam, one of my mother tongues, it is tangam, which means gold. Mankind practices neighborly love in the image of God's love for his creatures. I'm talking about the Christian notion of charitas. So in this sense, all creatures are the siblings of man according to Christian theology. But as we know, Gandhi's maker loves truths to which he has absolute fidelity. God made an orderly world following from the sovereign principle of truth. Therefore, Gandhi's love, the love which would found the community of men across the world, is the love for truth. And hence, when men are able to be truthful like unto God, then there will be a perfect world. And this is what he meant by taking the notion of Hind Swaraj towards the whole world. Once we have convinced Indians of the merits of such a vision, he said, we would convince the whole world and overwhelm it. As we found earlier, our fidelity to truth is evidenced in the orderly and regular world which follows from it. Such a society does not change over millennia. It remains the same like a perfect machine. Gandhi certainly imagined such a world without inventions, at the level of personal relations, social relations, and technologies. This is the root of Gandhi's apparent conservatism in most matters. Gandhi was acutely aware of the difficulty of this model of a political program. He knew that the difference between his God and mankind was one of limits. That is, God is the being without any limit, and that's why most theologies talk about God as absolute, that is, that which is not limited by some other thing. That is, God is without limit except for his absolute fidelity to truth. So Gandhi's God is, although free, is obliged to follow what Gandhi would call absolute truth. Therefore, but man has a very limited knowledge even of God, although man has been made in the image of the Maker, as we found earlier, that man is not yet the Maker. So for a reason for it is that man doesn't have perfect knowledge of the Maker. Therefore, Gandhi said, I have a limited knowledge of his purpose. At the same time, to know God is to know the purpose given to man by this Maker. So I quote Gandhi, man was made so that he would know his Maker. Now, the completion of this knowledge, as we found earlier, is to be the Maker. Now, I'm running out of time, and you can see that we are in the territory that Divya mentioned earlier, and she alluded that there is something about time that we will come to. When we speak about impartiality, we are talking about time. So, just as an aside, there is this philosopher, Jacques Derrida, who is known to almost everyone because everybody uses one of the words that he coined called deconstruction. So deconstruction is a very technical term. It's a problem. It's an examination of the consistency of a system. But Derrida once said that justice as a notion cannot be deconstructed because justice by definition is impartiality. As you know, there was no time limit. If there were no time limit, everyone could love everyone. We would be then able to learn and practice everything we want. Instead, the limit of time means that we always choose to do one thing over another. And politics is founded on this principle, that everything takes time and time is always limited. Now, we often carry with us a few caricatured ideas of politics. We think of it often as a mere power grab. Men used to become kings by grabbing vast areas of land, and then conspiracies and assassinations would exchange one king for another. These games of power are not politics. Then we also think today, as a cliche, that politics is the arena of corruption, and corruption is a very complex moral term. And the more recent caricature of an ideal polity is the place which creates viable business environments. But politics is possible because human beings can come together and create new worlds. This possibility is always present in every moment. For example, we can together grant each other the total freedom of movement across borders, across the world. We can do this today. Such freedom of movement will initiate new worldwide institutions, but they will also make nation states and their xenophobic politics even more irrelevant. In that sense, politics is the fight for freedom, which never stops. But we know that a new world always threatens the established order. Divya and I call this process and programs which restrain or banish politics and banish this fundamental freedom which makes politics possible, anti-politics. Gandhi's theology also does not permit politics, as you can see from the implications of what we have been saying so far. Perhaps Gandhi's theology also has even harsher implications, but that's for another occasion. Would you like to?
Yes. No. So let me just conclude by saying that we started by thinking what it meant to be in Gandhi's time. And perhaps we do have an intimation that we might not be, or we might be exiting Gandhi's time, but it's not just a natural passage. It's a question for us, and that also makes it politics. Should we remain in that time? And we saw that the ultimate commitment that Gandhi had was to the absolute concept of truth, or truth as a sovereign principle, and that to be true to this principle of truth requires that one loves everything, but that means a very different concept of love than the one that is in fact humanly possible. And it also means that there is an end to politics. So this is the outline of the question before us. Should we remain in Gandhi's time, and should we be tied by those commitments? At this moment, of course, we can't think whether we are with Gandhi or against Gandhi. And this model of being with or against someone is not very helpful at all when it comes to a great thinker. When it comes to lumpen politicians or gurus or organizations, I think this disstate is very healthy, so one should think with or against. But when it comes to a great thinker, they are more like opportunities. In fact, one could say that the more disturbing they are, the more precious they become, because they are an opportunity for us to exercise, not a program to follow, not a doctrine to implement. Gandhi was the first thinker on the subcontinent who pursued the meaning of life, or rather, in his case, the nihilism which negates the meaning of life. And he did this by bringing nihilism into an active relationship with politics. And we remember that he said politics is the snake with which he wrestles. So he was anti-political, but he had to engage this anti-political vision with politics itself in order to bring it about as an order on earth. His critique of civilization took the form of the perpetual negation of the city, of technology, of mobility. And it's a negation which he had in order to come to a point of a minimal living, so minimal that it would be quieter than the night. Gandhi expressed those tremors of thought before all of man's creations, whether it was cities, industries, transportation, communication systems, or to quote him one last time, newspapers at the touch of a button. And everyone today has newspapers at the touch of a button right here in the hall. These tremors which he brought to thought, they articulate a warning. In fact, each warning about the climate catastrophe, and in fact, a generalized guilt that we all feel at every pleasure that we would like to indulge in, every desire that we can envision for ourselves, and every invention that we are capable of. Gandhi's was a tremor before our desires, our pleasures, and our invention. It is with that that we should go away with the question, should we remain in Gandhi's time? Thank you.
So number one, you mentioned Gandhi's God and Gandhi's theology.
Take the mic closer, please.
Do you see Gandhi's notions of God as some form of proto-process theology, in the sense that God herself is an evolving entity in Gandhi's thought? And the second question is, Ambedkar, I think, very specifically mentioned, hello? Yeah. The second question that I have is that Ambedkar specifically mentions that somewhere that others went to Gandhi as devotees and disciples. I went to Gandhi as an opponent, and I saw him with his fangs bared. So which did you approach him as?
There is a Gandhi who was really interested in process theology. As you know, Ramachandra Gandhi, Gandhi's grandson. Ramachandra Gandhi wrote a book about the difficulty of reconciliation inside process theology, since you seem to know about how process philosophy works. So on the one hand, there is the idea of assemblage, which means you can constantly assemble things together in order to produce more complex organicities to think, or occasions to think. I'm using the technical word of Whitehead, occasions to think. And on the other hand, there is the duty of speculation, which is to unify what you assemble. And what Ramu Gandhi shows is a kind of impossibility of reconciling these two activities. And that, in fact, is the pleasure of process philosophy as something which always produces a kind of exuberant and a voluptuous world. And Gandhi would never have been comfortable with this notion of process. Instead, it's one thing, it's perhaps more interesting to read the Gandhi through the theological sections of Newton's Principia. That might be perhaps more interesting. Yeah.
I think the second question is related to that, to my mind. When you ask about how Ambedkar found Gandhi, and it was an interaction that was very important, very consequential, and took place over a long period. I think today, the kind of question that we wanted to raise requires that we move aside from rehearsing historically what happened in terms of either biographies or in terms of the historical processes themselves. But if we go back to what that fundamental battle between Gandhi and Ambedkar was, and of course it was a question of caste, which means it was a question of society and the transformation of society. There, what we have found about Gandhi's commitment to an ideal society based on an absolute truth would prevent social transformation, whereas what Ambedkar was asking for was a social transformation. In that sense, we can understand this battle again between politics that Ambedkar was for. In fact, in Annihilation of Caste, he says that let us think not in terms of religion, but let us think in terms of laws, because laws can change. But a religion, especially a religion with capital R, as Gandhi asked, a theologically informed religion of his conviction, would be one that would require that we exist with each other in society like clockwork. And I want to add a mention of a small text that Gandhi wrote, which is very well known, called The Ideal Bhangi. You may be familiar with the text, but if we keep in mind exactly what kind of a society would be ideal for Gandhi, a village society where the spatialization, the personal relations, social relations should remain as they are. And then if he requires that there should be an ideal Bhangi, then it's a very disturbing text. It is still a text that prevents social transformation. Whereas one example that we gave in the talk was, why not imagine a world which is without caste borders, which does not ask us to inherit communities, inherit inequalities? And why not imagine a world which is without borders, which also means let us not inherit identities? So that would be the gist of the answer.